So in this part of the series, we're going to be working on making the curve, forming the curved top and all of the crown that goes with it. Now the problem with curved crown is you can't just use a flat piece, you have to build up the dimension. You kind of see on this frame that if you have a curved piece of crown, you try to tilt it like you would on a ceiling, the angle is off from the center to the wall. So that's why you'll see I make a series of three thicknesses I have to build up to get this crown. So what I started with was just a rough template. I make a more accurate one a little bit later, and I just had my rough dimensions on there because I was going to have to joint some of this lumber together to get this curve. Luckily the curve was pretty subtle. When I first looked at the drawings I thought it might have to be multiple parts, but I can get the curve by just putting two boards together. I didn't want to butt joint these, so what I did was I made angled laps in the center, and that's how I joined the two pieces. The first cut of this was a little bit of trial and error getting the angle right, but after I got it accurate I was able to make the other. Like I said, there's 3 layers to this. This lumber is about 13/16 inch thick, so this is going to be a fairly thick piece of lumber once it's done. I show making 2 of these, but there's really 3. And then that's what that joint looks like. It's just a lap. I set my radial arm saw. I think this first one was about a 32-degree angle. Halfway down the piece, exact same process as a flat lap. Everything's just at an angle. And then the bottom piece here is a little bit skinnier, so you can see I have that first one drying up. This one I used to stop so I could get a little more accurate with my cuts. And this was a different degree. I think I show it later. I think it was 24. So like I said, a little bit of trial and error getting these accurate. Yeah, 24 degrees, and then I could glue these together as well. So then I just made a real quick large scale compass in my shop. So I just have this piece of wood attached to a piece of plywood. Everything's in a straight line, so that line that goes through the center of my piece is the same line that goes through where my nail is set. I have the radius, which is on the plans in here, and I could just draw my curves. So that is what that is. I drew a couple extra lines marking where moldings need to be, and then I could cut this out. So the best way to do this, in my opinion, is the way I'm doing it. I'm making patterns that have this 1/2 inch plywood. That's because that's what I have in the shop. You don't have to use such a nice grade of wood, but that's what I had. And then I could sand those. I got a pretty nice cut with the jigsaw, but I sanded that plywood, and then I could transfer that pattern onto my curved pieces. So I'm using a flush cut trim bit. The bearing is on the top side of this, so that's why I'm mounting this on. Some of these trim bits have the bottom on the bearing on the bottom. It doesn't really matter. You either have to flip this upside down or have the plywood on the top, and then I could go and make a flush cut. I lied, my bearing is on the bottom, and that's how I did all these. It's a time-consuming process, but it was the best way to get this as accurate as possible. So that's how I went about doing that. You can see before I did this, I think I'll show it in one of the clips, I rough cut out the mahogany. My experience with these trim bits is if you're trying to overdo it and remove too much material, especially on a thicker hardwood, the bearings can start to fail. So I'm going to start with, this is actually the middle piece, and I need to put a mark in it for where my curve on the bottom will start. In order to do this, I started by just having a scrap piece of wood taped to the bottom of my router. I didn't want to make a ton of jigs. If you've been watching this process, it's already a long process with lots of jigs. I wanted to quickly make this mark. This worked well for a little bit, but then it started to move, so I was actually able to clamp a piece of wood to the bottom of my trim router. That piece of wood follows the curve perfectly, and I use this technique for building this whole thing. So you can see I'm going around the piece. I actually made some of this crown for the sides, which I ended up didn't using, but so I didn't show it in the video, but that's what I'm using kind of to get these patterns. And all I'm doing is copying the plans. So the plans have all the dimensions in it for me, so that's where all my thicknesses and my designs coming from. So then the bottom of this will have that OG bit, but it's not an exact copy of it, but it gets me close enough. So you can see I can create that curve, and then I basically just have to remove this little bit of material. You can see how it will meet the steps of where my other piece of molding will start. So all I did for that is you could kind of see where I had started that. I'm flipping one of my chisels upside down, and I could follow that curve and then work it into what I already created. So pretty simple if you have, this isn't even an expensive set of chisels to remove a little bit of material and make that a continuous curve. So then the next bit is I had to make the top molding. So it's the same dimension. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to cut off this bottom bit. That was my original line on the bottom there, and then I could reuse that pattern. So you could see how I broke this up into multiple pieces. This ended up being over 2 inches thick. So what I did was I planned out which detail molding was going on which piece based on the thickness. So this top piece is going to be an S curve. So same exact process. Like I said, all I did was cut that bottom off of my original pattern. You can see this is what I was talking about when I said I rough cut out this mahogany so I don't overbear my router. And then that is what that looks like. I'm also using my bigger router, not my trim router, to do this pattern cutting. There is my pattern. I'm just using double-sided tape to attach these pieces. And like I said, I did this 3 times. And that is what that basically looks like. So I left about 3/16 of an inch material to remove. You get a nice view of that lap joint in the center, and I could just go around and trim all of this out. Like I said, the problem with projects like this is you're building a lot of materials you won't really use again. This curve is pretty specific to this project, so it was a lot of work, especially for this top part, to get all these forms. And then you can see how this will fit on top of the other one, and I could start forming the curve on this one. So this one was pretty simple. It was just a simple S curve. So there's an indentation on the top and then a curve on the bottom. There will also be an extra piece of molding I add to this at the end. So if you've been watching these videos, you know, especially on the cove cutting on the table saw was kind of out of the question for this one. So I just used an angle grinder to rough form this curve. Like I said, it's very subtle. Especially since it's layered, so it's not as difficult to do on the crown, which you're always anticipating it being tilted. This is going to stay flat. So I just went through and removed the bulk of the material with an angle grinder. And then I could follow up with a belt sander, which is nice. The nose of this belt sander fits in these curves perfectly. I could clean that up, and then once that's done, I switch over to an orbital and then really finish up that curve. So pretty simple stuff. Like I keep saying, these were subtle details, especially when you break this up into multiple pieces. It's a little bit easier. It's a longer process, but the technique is a little bit easier because you're not having to make all those specialty cuts on the table saw. And then that is what that piece looks like. And then I can just final sand it a little bit in my vise. Now, like I said, this is going to be up pretty high, so obviously I wanted this to look nice, but you're not going to notice little hand, since it's made by hand, you're not going to notice little undulations in the finish, and then I could glue these two together. Now, like I said, there's going to be a third piece after this, but that third piece has to have some different detailing done to it. These two, I knew they could be glued together at this point. So like I said, I was using 3 pieces of this. I didn't show you how I lapped together this third piece, but it's the exact same process. The original curve I cut out, the bottom part, I was able to reuse for my pattern, which was nice. Being able to reuse these was nice. So that is the mark I have to go to. And so you can see on the compass how I did that. I just bring the compass to that mark, and then I could draw what I need. And same process, I cut that out with a jigsaw, and then I could mark up where it needs to go on the mahogany. Now this one's going to be attached to the ones above it, so I'm only going to define that bottom curve. The top side I want to keep, so I have some material to glue to the inside of this frame. So this was a little bit easier. I just had to rough cut out the bottom, and then same exact process, use the pattern to use the trim bit and get it perfect. And this one was also nice. This is a flat piece of trim, so there's no detailing on it. So this one's pretty much done. And that was what that is. Like I said, 3 thicknesses in order to get all of that material. So then on this one, what it is the bottom of this has to have that second piece of mahogany, and there's a little bit of an overhang. So what I'm going to do on the back side of this piece is I'm going to route a little groove so that curved piece can set in this groove, and that will form my bottom. So I already had this set up for the grooves I made on the other ones. Same process, I had that little piece of wood clamped to the bottom, and I could go through and make that. The bit I'm using is a 1/4 inch, but my thickness of my mahogany was 5/16, so I had to do one pass, move that essentially fence on the bottom of the router over, and make a shallow second pass. I temporarily had this screwed into this piece. I knew there was going to be a lot of fitting to get this to fit on the angle of the cornice, so I wanted to be able to detach this bottom piece if I had to. That ended up being a little bit of a lifesaver, and you'll see why. So I kind of propped this in place because I knew I had to trim the bottom of this in order to meet that 5 degree of the cornice. So you can see it's not setting flat, and that is because the bottom of my molding's flat, but the cornice is not. So I have to go through and put that 5 degree angle on the bottom of this cornice. So I kind of just calculated the offset I would need for that based on the height of my molding. So it's 2 3/8 inch thick. I needed to cut about go in about 1/4 inch in order to get that 5 degree angle. So all I did was I propped this on a piece of cedar I had, and I offset this top fence by 1/4. So if I ride my blade along these 2 fences, you can see how I have it resting against the 2, it'll give me that subtle angle. That was kind of the easiest way I could think of to cut this in the shop with the tools I had. It was a little time consuming, but it ended up working out. It was hard to get a good angle of this process. You can kind of see here how I'm using the saw against those 2 fences in order to cut that out. And then that is what the finished product looked like. I had to do a little bit of sanding in order to perfect it, but then it fit on top. So then at this point I have to start testing the curved top. Like I said, this mahogany was kiln dried, so even though I got it to bend, it was springing back quite a bit. So I had clamps on my form at this point. I loosened them just enough in order to slide that piece of mahogany forward, still keeping the back one clamped, and I was able to clamp it to the top, kind of test everything out. And that is what that looks like. This was the point when I realized a fairly large mistake. This was my mistake. I completely overlooked it in the plans. That bottom piece of molding dead ends into the top of the cornice, whereas the longer molding overhangs. When I was building this, I just thought I would make this molding and I would cut the end at a 45. It was a total oversight on my part. You can see how this has to line up on one edge, and on the other edge I was off by a little over 1 inch. So it has to look like this. So I basically had to add a little over 1 inch to this material. I'm still mad about this because it's still sitting in my shop and I could see it every day, but I basically just had to add some material to the middle. It kind of looks like a keystone, which makes it work, but all I did was I cut it in half and I added that little bit. I wanted to kind of build this up like laps so it was still strong. So I made this T piece for the center with some dowels, and then I cut into the molding a little bit in the middle. The second layer I cut into it so that one's nestles in place, and then the top piece will just sit on there. Like I said, this was my fault. I just wasn't paying attention. It was a small detail. Like I said, I thought I just had to make the curve and I could cut it, but it didn't work out that way. This was actually a quick fix for what it was. It's more so that it's visually glaring at this point. This finish is not staying mahogany, but that is essentially not really going to be seen at the end of the day anyway. So once that dried, I could go through and just form this. It was this very small bit, so I just used a chisel in order to form this to the piece. And aside for the changes in the grain and the little bit of undulations in the color, because this is all natural wood, it ended up working out really well. And you could see now this overhangs properly and my corners meet in place. So like I said, I'm still a little bummed about it just because it looked so nice before, but it was a pretty simple fix. And I thought I could wrap this up in this video, but I'm going to have one more video finishing this project next week, and then I'm going to be moving on to something else.